Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School about World War II discussions and stories. This is episode 6 of season 4, and this is going to be on the Sino-Japanese War. With me today are Emmett Scoble.
Hi, I'm Emmett.
Nico Thomas.
Hi, I'm Nico.
And Austin Durrell.
Hi, I'm Austin.
And today's topic really is one that is not covered, I don't think, very much at all in most history classes. In a world history class, you would talk about it maybe for a moment, not in U.S. history too much, but we have a World War II class, so we do cover it. And lucky for them, we went over it like a week and a half before we had the podcast, so that always helps. And there's a lot of sources on this that we use, and then they use some good things, and I think they said they broke Britannica looking up things.
Yeah.
So it's really an interesting topic because one of the questions becomes, when does World War II start? And a lot of people go September 1st, 1939, with the Nazi invasion of Poland. For the United States, we say December 7th, 1941. But for the people in China, this really starts, you could argue, as early as 1931. You could really go 1937. Right.
Yep.
And so for today, we're going to be talking about, that 1937 invasion. And the boys are going to kind of give you context for this, and they're going to give you an explanation of what happened. This is an overview. By no means is it going to go into huge depth on things. Yeah. But we may save that for a second episode. So I think Emmett is going to start us off, and he's going to kind of give us a good contextualization for why the Japanese did what they did.
Right. So, Japanese expansion. So, they led their expansion through Asia through their means of Pan-Asianism. And so the definition of real Pan-Asianism is the concept of bringing together all Asian countries politically, economically, culturally, and just bringing them all together as one, uniting them. And so some context before World War II of Pan-Asianism. So some Pan-Asianists contend that unifying Asia is necessary to end Western dominance because they all really saw Western countries, imperialization as evil, and that was a common tie that they all had to turn against them.
I actually got a question. What other nations besides Japan champion this ideology?
So some other countries besides Japan was even China, even though we see through the Civil War, but the fights between China and Japan, China was definitely a big supporter in different times. There was even some people from India that also very heavily supported the idea of Pan-Asianism.
And I'm sure, especially with the how big of a control Great Britain and outside Western powers had on India and China, that heavily influenced their ideas of wanting to unify as Asians right. instead of as Westerners.
So that brings it back to the idea of their mutual agreement of Western dominance being the main unification reason for them to come together as a whole. So more historical contents before them. So you could say their triumph over Russia in 1905 in the Russia-Japanese War, it really strengthened Japanese as a hub, as a national movements, undermining the idea of a white racial superiority, and igniting debates about possible conflicts involving all combined Asian ethnicities. And so the emergence and ideology of Pan-Asianism, it started really early. So the first ideas of Pan-Asianism began in small ways, such as Terui Tokichi, which wrote Daito Gaparan. And in his writing, his concept was proposing Japan and Korea as a federation. And his theory was that although Asia had some obviously big countries such as China, the smaller countries' only chance of survival was collaborating together as a whole. And some different people who brought up the emergence of Pan-Asianism ranged through all different types of countries in Asia. So one from Japan, a Japanese art historian, Okakura Tenshin, he highlighted how Asian countries are united by their common cultural history. A Pan-Asian cultural identity was pushed, definitely in his book, The Ideals of the East. So an Indian poet and philosopher named Rabindranath Tagore, he promoted the notion of a common Asian ancestry by highlighting the spiritual and cultural ties across all Asian countries. And Sun Yat-sen, he was a revolutionary leader in China who promoted Asian unity against Western imperialism and put up the 3 principles of people which prioritize livelihood, democracy, and nationalism.
Sun Yat-sen is also one of the main factors in the Chinese Civil War. He's the nationalist leader.
Right. So, And then that's the emergence of Pan-Asianism, and we see in the key tenets and goals that the main goal, obviously, of early Pan-Asianism was just Asian unity as a whole, having peace among all of Asia and all of its different countries. Again, another main goal that they had was obviously overcoming Western imperialism and resisting Western dominance. They wanted to hold a cultural bond together, collaboration between all different countries, helping unify and excel every country as a whole, together and separate, and bringing together Asian leadership, encouraging powerful Asian countries to direct regional development and subvert the power of the West. And the spread of these ideals came through many different ways, which had come from philosophical circles such as scholarly papers, political movements, cultural exchanges, diplomacy, education, and even Japanese territorial growth contributed to the unification of Asia. So Pan-Asianism in the interwar period, the rise of Japanese Pan-Asianism itself really started with the success of Japan's modernization. So when Japan modernized, they were kind of seen as a model or like somebody to look up to in Asia, as many different of the other countries saw them as somebody to go off of. They saw when they brought about the idea of Pan-Asianism, they said, hey, look, maybe this is a good idea. Maybe this will help excel our own country. So Japan's Meiji Restoration in 1868 actually set an example for other Asian countries, leading Japanese intellectuals to believe that their nation might take the lead in reviving Asia. In response to Western dominance, Japanese intellectuals also promoted Pan-Asianism as just a substitute power structure in order to, in an effort to challenge them in Asia. And their expansion, Japanese expansion, the Pan-Asianism movement was sparked by perceptions of Japanese dominance over leadership in Asia, which were strengthened by both Japanese triumphs over China and further mentoring their dominance over Russia in the previous war. So Japanese expansionism and Pan-Asianism rhetoric. So leadership claims, the idea that Japan was superior to other countries in Asia was reinforced by its military victories. The idea that Japan was a natural leader in advancing Pan-Asianism and determining the future of the region was strengthened by this heavily. So the impact of Pan-Asianism on their foreign policy was very important, because Japan's foreign policy, they started as an isolated country, really stayed to themselves, and then all of a sudden they started getting more involved with Asia, really trying to bring each other together for their own means and their own likeliness. So Japan promoted unity through cultural diplomacy, made partnerships, and presented itself as a pioneer in promoting collaboration amongst the nations. And then later on, after the context of before World War II, then we see Pan-Asianism during World War II, which led to Japanese occupation, propagation of Pan-Asian ideals. So Japanese troops suppressed local identities, imposing their old brand of Pan-Asianism, which was considered the culture, language, customs. And the way they did things, they started by claiming they were bringing each other together, collaborating ideals and cultures. And what they were really doing was abusing this ideal and making an excuse to impose their other culture on all other countries.
And further to Emmett's point, you can see this throughout the Second Sino-Japanese War, which we're later going to further delve into, through physical acts of human degradation, and not just cultural suppression, as well as just acts of just inhumanity. And we see this throughout Japanese campaign through the Pacific, heavily going against the more widely accepted idea of Pan-Asianism, and just showing how Japanese centric they truly believe, how much supremacy they truly believe they had over Asia. And I think we and I have talked about this in the past, we feel like it heavily relates to the idea of manifest destiny, where you see a common thread of two nations, being USA and Japan, maybe finding these ways of uniting an area, or realizing that they have this destiny to achieve something, and then using that and as a rallying cry for their people and for the area that they're in, to then go achieve those goals, even if it may not be in the most humane ways possible.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and there's also a little touch too of extreme nationalism that's Japan is known for since the Meiji Restoration, where they have this strong cultural identity, and it's almost like they fuse that with the idea of Pan-Asianism, and instead of it being all Asian people are equal, it's no, we just don't want Westerners to control Asia.
Yeah,
we want,
but we can. Yeah, and there's a push too to and they look at China as the dominant East Asian power for most of history, and then in the 20th century, really after the first Sino-Japanese War, and then obviously going into the second, that they're going to be the dominant power, and that's the ultimate play. Is it's a combination of that Pan-Asianism, expel the Westerners, that gets the populace involved, but it's also a nationalistic view of it installs our culture, our way of life, and who cares about the other ones. And so I think in a true Pan-Asian type thing, a lot of their occupations would have been much different. You're not going to see the massacres of civilians like you're going to talk about later. So, no, very good.
This is definitely a heavily warped version of the term.
Right. And the Japanese, not only by just straight up imposing their own ideals and stuff, they also used many other different methods, such as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, in which they brought together cooperation between many different Asian countries in attempt to obviously spread their idea more in their own way, just to conquer Asia themselves instead of doing it for the better of the continent. And so Pan-Asianism in the occupied territories they had, the culture and social changes were definitely suppressed in an effort just to bring the seized regions into line with Japan's ideal of Pan-Asian unity. Japan also used forced labor and resource extraction from these occupied territories to fund its war effort, frequently under the name of promoting the Pan-Asian cooperation and development. And there were many challenges and criticisms of Pan-Asia, such as obviously the forced cultural integration. Rather than being unified, locals opposed the Japan's imposition of its culture. Lack of cooperation was seen rather than promoting true cooperation. Everybody turned to see Japan's effort as just self-serving, imperialist, and they later then saw Japan's intentions to be mistrusting. And then the divisions of conflict, rather than fostering unity, Japan's occupation planted seeds of dissension among the ethnic communities occupying the conquered regions. So the response and resistance to Pan-Asianism from local populations first was they really just wanted to preserve themselves. Japan was practically forcing their culture on them. They wanted to keep their own culture, keep their own politics, economics. So preservation of their national identity included people rebelling against Japan's forced integration, opposition to their occupation, anger caused by historical abuse, and all Asian countries that were conquered, that were pushed from Japan by this Pan-Asianist ideals, they all had different priorities. So as a result of their disparate interests, several ethnic groups resisted Japan's attempts to unite them under Pan-Asianist principles.
And holdings of Japan that can be referenced in this is especially is the Korean sentiment and the lasting Korean sentiment of anti-Japanese rhetoric, as well as the conquering in 1931 of Japanese-held Manchuria, northeast China. Mm-hmm. In both of those areas, you can heavily see anti-Japanese rhetoric. Of course, this was the backlash there was not nearly as strong as the backlash in China, where they fought in a full-on war rather than just a series of conflicts. But you can see throughout this Japanese expansion, no one is really these. Like Emmett says, these ethnic communities are not consenting to this. You could say.
Right. And so, now that we see all the opposition and the reactions from the occupied territories themselves, there are also many different international reactions and definite opposition to Japan's actions based on their Pan-Asianism. So the Allied resistance, they saw many countries such as the U.S., the UK, they saw Japan's Pan-Asianism just as a front for expansion, and they did such as cutting off all trade such as oil all to Japan. the support for nationalists definitely was seen from different countries in an effort to weaken Japan's authority themselves. Western countries supported the nationalist movements all over Asia that were opposing Japan themselves.
Yeah, and to your point, and I know we've been on Pan-Asianism for a little bit, so I think we'll kind of skip ahead, but you do have these nationalist movements of independence in, say, like Korea or Vietnam or China, obviously. And so I think where the Pan-Asianism starts is really, it's just the rationale, and it's a good political thing for Japan to say, hey, we're kicking out the colonizers, the invaders, but they essentially just replace them. It's not like they're doing the right thing here. So, but that's going to be the precursor to this whole invasion thing, and I think that's really important for people to understand. And that whole idea of Pan-Asianism really puts you in that backdrop of everything that's going on. And so, like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I know you guys got a whole bunch of stuff to do. But y'all, any last things you want to mention on Pan-Asianism?
I mean, the most things, obviously, we see the international oppositions to it, but really the legacy after Pan-Asianism, post-World War II, kind of like obviously discredit the value of the term itself, especially because of Japan's defeat, obviously because of their aggressive acts towards all countries across Asia, as well as intellectual circles, Cold War and Western influence, and things such as that.
And definitely heavily piggybacking off of the inspiration of nationalistic movements throughout parts of Asia that this extremely aggressive and imperial tactic Japan took. I think it would be now is the best time to go over to Austin's topic of the Chinese Civil War, which was extremely outlined by nationalistic views of the Kuomintang party. And Austin, if you want to just take it from there.
Okay, yeah. So before I get into the actual Civil War, I want to give a little background on China in the early 20th century. So the early 20th century was like a huge changing point for China. The end of imperial rule stopped in 1912, and after that, the Republican rule, the Republic of China, was established by Yan Senkai, a military general, who, after Sun Yat-sen took his reign and tried to turn it into a monarchy, really, which wasn't supported very much, and he resigned in 1916. And after his resignation, China went to a warlord era where different regions of China were controlled by different warlords who basically, China was in ruins, really. It was different conflicts happening all across, and warlords arguing with others because a bunch of different political leaders with their own independent parts of China don't really agree too much.
Right. So just adding to this, we can really see the state they're in and why Japan feels now is the time for this switch of power in the Pacific region.
If they see China's in a really bad state not much no cooperation within China whatsoever. So this is the perfect opportunity for them to go in and strike and try and because Japan's one of their main goals before, during, and after World War II is to obtain mainland China.
And that's obviously because of the resources there, especially when they're gearing up for war with the United States. And
during World War II, the United States cut off trade to Japan through metal, oil, all that. So it's a big motivator for them to go get inland from China.
Yeah.
But moving on, So the nationalists and communists,
those are two major
groups. The nationalists, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, which was ruled by Mao Zedong.
Okay.
They obviously they didn't like each other. Nationalists, communists. It's the whole Civil War, basically, them two fighting each other. They actually come together during this warlord period to try and restore actual rule to China, because everybody knows a warlord that was no good for China. So they come together to set rule to China, and then
to, of course, defend against the oncoming Japanese forces.
And so they come together to form a unitary China. The warlord period ends, and after that, the Civil War breaks out between the communists and the nationalists. and this goes on for quite some time, and it comes to an end around 1935, I believe, during when Japan invades China.
Yep.
And so the agreement that the nationalists and the communists made to fight against the warlords, they make a similar agreement to stop their fighting back and forth so that they can defend against the Japanese incoming, like trying to take over mainland China.
Okay.
And so
And how would you say they were balancing this responsibility, this like oncoming force? Because at the time, Japan was, I would assume, is much more of a military powerhouse than these divided Chinese forces.
well, yeah, Japan, as Emmett was saying, their industrialization and economic like growth, it helped them, it benefited them. They had much more advanced like weaponry and all that and tactics than the Chinese, especially since the Chinese were like just had finished rebuilding. So they had a huge advantage.
Yeah, there's only a couple of the Chinese, I think, have they don't have any mechanized units.
Yeah.
Very few, no tanks that are modern. The Japanese aren't big on tanks either, but they only have a couple of major units in 1937 that are really well trained, and almost all of them are eliminated. I want to say in the initial 2 months. So the training and the quality of soldier is definitely a Japanese advantage. Their military is, way above the capabilities of the Chinese. The Chinese have a lot of people, though, a lot of numbers.
Yeah.
And they do get better over time.
That also leads to the death toll that racks up throughout this war.
Correct. Yeah.
The heavily populated areas.
And the Chinese are actually importing their military training. They're bringing in Germans. At first, it's the Nazis actually, ironically, helping out, and then eventually the Soviets and
communists. Right.
And we send people over eventually too. So they get ironically trained by Western powers, and I say ironically because we just talk about Pan-Asianism, and so that actually led to propaganda from the Japanese saying this is just a Western army, collaborators. And so that becomes a whole nother thing. So sorry to interrupt, Emmett.
But going off of that, with Japan having much more advanced forces and all this, China chose to photo mostly guerrilla warfare and resistance to try it.
Much by, like Coach Arvati said, much by the encouragement of their German advisors.
And so the KMT and CCP, they decided to engage with this guerrilla warfare to try and fend off the Japanese. It was led by Mao Zedong, the CCP led by Mao Zedong. They were particularly effective in leading these guerrilla campaigns in the rural areas. And the resistance efforts, they weakened Japanese controls to build support for the KMT and CCP. Even though they were cooperating, the KMT and CCP, they still had tensions during this united time of trying to defend the Japanese.
Yeah.
And so the new Fourth Army incident in 1941 was when the KMT attacked CCP units that led to a temporary breakdown of the alliance. And they came back together to eventually try and fend off the Japanese. But after this, the external support for the Chinese received very limited support from like allied powers, but this little support did help the Chinese very much, like the Flying Tigers from the United States. And so after this,
just to clarify, with external support, like you say, U.S. support, were these going towards the communists as well as the nationalists, or were these focused on one of these groups?
Well, at this time, they still had their united alliance towards the Japanese.
Okay.
So it would just go towards China as a whole, since it wasn't like technically in the Civil War at the time, even though tensions were still high and they were still bickering back and forth. But eventually they managed to beat the Japanese and get most of their land back after this. But basically, the reason they were able to fend off the Japanese is because they lost to the Americans during World War II, which forced them to surrender to China and stop war efforts in China. So really, if it wasn't for that, I feel like the Japanese would have taken over China completely because China was in ruins basically when Japan was attacking, and so But after Japan like takes away their attacking on China and all this, China goes basically immediately right back to their civil war. They break their alliance, and so after this, the Chinese Civil War, it concludes in 1949 with the victory of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, and Mao Zedong has proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China, marking an end to the nationalist government rule and the beginning of a communist-led government.
Yeah, and so at the end of the story with the Civil War, the communists win. And actually, there's a lot of reasons for that, because the nationalists were actually probably, I would say, before the Japanese get there, the nationalists have far more control over China. The communists are really in the rural areas. They're in the back burner.
Yeah.
But because this conflict goes for so long, starting in 1937, ending in 1945.
The nationalists really take the head of the...
Correct, yeah. They take the nationalists take the brunt of it, and they take the blame for a lot of stuff. And Chiang Kai-shek does do some things that are not necessarily blameless. And so...
Which we will.
Yeah.
Be getting to soon.
Yeah. And just to finish off of Austin's point and Coach Rivi's point, you really see this how one-sided the conflict was when Japan was focused on the Chinese front instead of the U.S. front, especially with the Battle of Shanghai and the Battle of Nanjing, which I'll be going into right now. These attacks or these advancements by the Japanese Central Army Group were extremely one-sided. They were easily able to sweep down the coast of China and overrun the significantly, like Coach Rivi says, significantly less prepared Chinese soldiers, especially when you think about the fact that this is a divided China, like Austin's saying, and you have a army of much more militarized Japanese, like Emmett described, who were in the mindset that this was their right to take this land because they were basically the protectors of Asia, and that this land was their land. As preface for the Nanjing massacre, the Japanese Central Army first had taken over Shanghai, and whereas on their march down, you see the type of behavior that was going to be expected in Nanking. Preface, Nanking and Nanjing are interchangeable names for the city. Yes. Nanjing being the more modern terminology for it. But I will say Nanking going forward just to simplify it. The behavior of this Japanese advancing force can be easily foreshadowed as on their approach to the city and to the oncoming battle. Right. You saw these soldiers under the direct order of their commanders and generals to be allowed to murder, pillage, rape. One of the wider customs in the Japanese army during this time, and that was really one of the more disgusting things, was the use of what are you saying?
So adding on to that point about them just doing whatever they want to citizens and stuff, I believe the numbers were 2 million soldiers dead versus 4 million civilians.
Jeez. And that isn't talking about the amount of women or as talked about as referred to by the Japanese as comfort girls that were consistently abused by these Japanese soldiers completely against their will. And that just shows throughout the retelling of this war. But going into the battle itself, or as for context of the battle, Nanking is located in the Jiangsu province near the Yangtze River and close to the coast, which was mostly held, and it was the capital of nationalist Kuomintang at this time.
And it's a historical capital.
As well. Yeah,
dating back to the 1600s. So Nanjing is a symbolic city as well, which I think is important to go. Just
showing how, with the oncoming loss of this, how dominant Japan, how it was looking at this war. Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, as said by Austin Durrell. Before Japanese forces took the city, Kai-shek decided that he would withdraw his troops, knowing he'd lose the troops based on their performance in the Battle of Shanghai. He, in favor, chose to fight a war of attrition out in the countryside instead of trying to fight them head on in the city. This also aligns with Austin's points of favoring guerrilla warfare due to the different numbers and the more established, more well-trained Japanese forces. However, while Chiang Kai-shek believed this, he also, and this goes to show how much he despised, how his ego was clouding his judgment in a lot of these decisions. While he believed that he should retreat from the city, he also felt that there should be no peace treaties or no armistices reached with the Japanese at this point to maybe at any point evacuate the city or save some of these civilians. The battle, the national forces led by Tang Shengzi announced the city would not surrender and would fight to the death. Tang gathered about 100,000 soldiers, largely untrained, including Chinese troops who had participated in the Battle of Shanghai. This is important. This shows that these troops are already demoralized and are in no state to fight this oncoming Japanese force. The Japanese government left for relocation on December 1st, given this was their capital and they had to leave, and the president left on December 7th, leaving the fate of Nanjing to an international committee led by John Rabe, a German national and Nazi sympathizer or Nazi party member.
No, he's a Nazi.
Yeah, Nazi party. Sorry, Nazi party member.
He keeps claiming that Hitler's going to save him. That's one of his big claims, that the Fuhrer will not abandon him.
Yeah. Well, and in a way, Japan's relationship with Germany at the time is what ultimately saves him and many others. John Rabe also would go on to lead an international safe zone throughout the 6 weeks.
Right. So we talk about these international safe zones, and I was wondering if maybe you could just elaborate on how they worked in general, because we see and talk about how the Japanese army was so brutal in their ways of invading China, just the way they went about
Well, I can completely do that. And when going into Nanking, you also have to see that in many of these Asian cities, there is a large international community, and this is occurring. Most of this is occurring in 1937. This is before 1939. This is before Germany had fully declared war on the entire world. This is before the U.S. had gotten into this war. So Japan still cares about the reputation in the international community, and so even though Japan is treating all of these Chinese civilians with such harsh and inhumane ways, the common consensus is that if you are an international, obviously this is going to change in going into Nanking. If you are a international person in this area, you are safe from these tortures and inhumanities shown by the Japanese. Right. The battle for Nanking and the surrounding area, going back into the battle for Nanking and the surrounding area began December 1st, and Japan quickly pushed the defending forces into the city. These Chinese forces, being tired, demoralized, and genuinely afraid, they were even fighting in between the units to get away from the advancing Japanese forces, knowing the fate that would lie to them if they were captured by the Japanese.
Yeah, and then at a certain point, as you get further in, they're going to take off all their military clothes. And when the Japanese get in, and this happened in a couple different cities.
And this is what leads to Japanese rationale
to massacre people, correct? Yes. Yeah. And the Japanese find just like all these military uniforms, either in piles that were burning or just on the side of the street. And that's what is, like you said, going to lead to some of those massacres.
And exactly like Coach Roy says, they see this and they immediately, who already don't need an excuse to do this stuff, feel like since there are military units, we can treat every single civilian here as a potential combatant. Immediately upon arrival to the city, the Japanese forces started looting, murdering, and raping the people in Nanking. Another example of on the way there, however, was Japanese soldiers having a competition, and this just shows the brutality of the Japanese and how sadistic they could be. Japanese soldiers having a competition of who could behead the most Chinese people in a certain amount of time. This was documented happening on the advance of Nanking. Within the city, the Chinese people, depending on if they were infirmed or injured, men, women, or children, would be brought into different areas of the city. These people would immediately started being executed. People who tried to escape into either the safe zone or out the city would be mowed down by machine gunners who were set up throughout the city. Adding to the horror and chaos of these killing sprees by the Japanese, the soldiers would oftentimes get extremely intoxicated before and after their sprees. Civilians would try and use this advantage to escape to the safe zone or without the city when their captors were oftentimes passed out drunk. This goes to show how little these Japanese soldiers cared about these people. They were truly treating them with no humanity. The Japanese primarily and sadistically used their fixed bayonets to execute these people. In a very troubling sense, they would kill anybody from men, women, pregnant women, old people, children, babies, anybody. And it truly showed the lack of humanity that these soldiers had for the civilians of Nanking and of China. Another aspect of the Nanking massacre was the the torture and use of sexual assault that it had on the civilians, where anywhere between 20,000 and 80,000 were brutally assaulted by these Japanese soldiers and were oftentimes mutilated or killed after. Really going to show how terrible the conditions were there. This would all go up to about 6 weeks of this happening consistently. And the final death toll for this event, which is oftentimes not talked about enough, especially due to how many people were killed in it, was from anywhere from 200 to 300,000 people. Even more so, given the fact that the Japanese burned and got rid of many evidence of their actions in China, as well as the many people that were drowned in the nearby river and bodies could not be seen.
Right. And so we see how this correlates to the point how Japan was trying to find ways and reasons to justify their ways of doing all these terrible deeds. And we see how through Pan-Asianism, how they started by justifying Pan-Asianism as a start just to unify all Asian cultures, culturally, politically, economically, and we see how worse and worse it gets over time.
And quickly it devolves and is taken advantage of and warped by the Japanese.
Yeah, and you throw in racial ideologies, basically eugenic ideologies that the Chinese are considered to be inferior, and the soldiers who, we talked about this in class, I mean, these guys have been raised on this. There's no 10-year period. It's their whole lives.
Japan at this point is a militaristic country.
Yeah, and they look at these people as being subhuman. And for the POWs they capture, and we know this, most Americans know this because they know how American POWs were treated by Japanese, not very well. They do not regard surrender as a good process, and they look at Asians who surrender as people who should be killed. And that also results in it. And so there's just a complete breakdown in everything that normal militaries are known to do. And I think that's important to point out is that, yes, rape happens in war. Civilian deaths happen in war. This was at a scale and a level that we really don't see it really that much in this conflict, and it really not talked about a lot either.
In a slightly bright spot in this horrible event, the establishment of one of these safety zones that Emmett brings up was seen by the Nazi John Robb, who had felt, and other journalists and international people who had set up in an area in a west part of the city, and oftentimes would go out and try to find as many Chinese people that they could shelter in this area. At times, these Japanese soldiers would try and grenade this area, but for the most part, it was largely left unalone, and it was the best chance for Chinese people, civilians in the city, to survive the consistent massacre that was happening outside this safe zone. The aftermath. In 1940, in a twisted and ironic turn of events, the Japanese made Nanjing the capital of their Chinese puppet government Yuan, headed by Wang Jingwei, which my friend Austin did some research about, given the fact that, or Wang Jingwei, he was a former member of the KMT, the Nationalist Party. In the end, Wang Jingwei found himself in that position due to his disagreements with Chiang Kai-shek and his much more pro-Sun Yat-sen views. This led him to go to Japan in order to, quote-unquote, broker a peace deal. However, the secret agreement was made where he would be given the seat of power in the symbolic Nanking, and he would take over this government. Of course, after the war, he would be executed, and due to his collaboration with the Japanese government,
anyone who collaborated was executed.
Yes.
And by both sides, and then the Civil War breaks out again, and then it becomes anyone who they thought might have collaborated, or then it's just nationalists who they're just going to say, you collaborated because you were a nationalist.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how that all gets associated with it.
Although you cannot say that one person was responsible for the events of something at the scale of a massacre like this, of the hundreds of thousands of people, the global community had felt that the person in charge of the force during the attack of Nanking was Matsu Iwane, and he was a commanding general at the time of the Japanese Central China Front Army, which was the army that would ultimately advance on Shanghai and Nanking, as well as the countryside around it. He allowed the brutal rape and execution of many throughout China. And he truly allowed for his soldiers to act like this when in control of Nanking.
But you see, at the end of the day, the people blame him, but you have to think about it. He allowed this to happen, but it's still the soldiers who chose to do all these horrible things and all these horrible things.
Yeah, it definitely was the fact that there was a very inhumane look of the Chinese, like Coach Arvide says, from the ground up.
Because they looked at him as less than human.
As they looked at him as less than human.
And I think what Nico's getting at, too, though, is if the guy in charge of the army, and he sends orders, and that's what they really tag him on, is he sends orders that soldiers can do certain things. After this, by the way, they tell them not to do this in certain areas. So they actually do reassess after this takes place. And I think what Austin's getting at is it's still the individual's responsibility.
Yeah.
And we talk about that when we talk about on the other side of the world with Nazis involved in civilian massacres, where it's
especially in Poland and Russia.
Poland, France, Ukraine, Russia, it's their responsibility.
Right. And to give a different perspective from that point, you've got to think of these extreme, inhumane things done by the army. No person is really born like that. You've got to think of like
how
the kind of ideals that were forced on them constantly.
Conditioning from ideals, like you said, and then a group mentality, right? Yep. Once it's allowed and you have the officers saying, okay, go burn the house down, then more houses get burned down. And then, like, we said with the rapes, which I know we don't have to get too heavy into that, but that's like the more personal, brutal part to that, where women are just drugged from their homes and this is happening to them. It just turns into chaos. And there actually are internal investigations in Japan about this and a couple of other events. The looting is normal. The massacring at this scale this quickly is what's not normal.
Yeah.
And I don't think either country has ever gotten over it. They both debate over what happened, how many people, and everything else.
And this is shown through the punishment of Matsui and his Lieutenant General Tani Hisao, who was directly implicated in committing some of these acts of looting, plundering, murdering, and assault of people in Nanking. They were both found guilty of war crimes by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and ultimately were extradited to China and executed. This goes to show, and this also can be applicable to the Tokyo trials, where there was a very different approach, and this is for the closing sentiments. There's a very different approach in the post-war period of how do we, as the allies and as the quote-unquote victors, punish the people responsible in Europe and in Germany compared to in the East and in Japan, especially after we had just dropped the bomb. Because as you see, this is something that is much less known than an event like Auschwitz or the Holocaust or stuff like this, where so many people were indicted and killed, and Hitler himself killed himself. And if Hitler hadn't killed himself, he would have been most likely executed.
And this is why he did kill himself.
This is why he did kill himself.
Yeah, he didn't
where
win the trial.
You have the leader of a country that committed acts like this, such as Hirohito, not being indicted or not being accused of anything in these trials. And it goes to show the attempt the U.S. made at efficiently handling the war into the post-war Cold War era as trying to be as smooth as humanly possible, and trying to mitigate any serious reactions from the Japanese policies. And it led to maybe some more less in-depth punishments of these crimes committed by the Japanese government. But ultimately, we see multiple different sides of the Second Sino-Japanese War, from what Emmett talked about with the ideological side of it, from what Austin talked about with the Chinese Civil War, and it truly set up how Japan was so easily able to take advantage of this country, or this once extremely great country. And how it manifested on the front lines, how Japan's ideology and how their ability to just take any real look at these people as human, take the human aspect out of it, how that manifested in the form of the Nanking Massacre.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we now get a chance to look back at it as a big piece of history that doesn't get talked about enough, we think.
And first off, very good job, guys. You guys did a great job with the research and putting this together. And obviously, this was just a little, snippet of things that happened in the Sino-Japanese War. So I highly recommend people, doing a little research on that, because it's the second most violent part of World War II. The Nazi-Russian front is the most violent. This is right there with disputed numbers that rival it. And it's not really known about in Western circles, probably largely because China became communist. I would imagine that's the biggest part of it.
Yeah.
But overall, excellent job. And, this was just, again, really well done. I know, Nanking's kind of a downer to really end on.
Oh, yeah.
But you guys made it through really well. Emmett, do you have anything left to add, or are you good?
I mean, not much. I thought we kind of explained the whole snippet of it very well.
Austin, what about you?
Thank you for letting me go before Nico, because I don't want to be here till 5 o'clock. But I just want to say I think everybody did great, and this is extremely fun. I can't wait till
Austin's
next
got
semester.
jokes.
Yeah. Well, guys, great podcast. And this is Tigers by the Fire signing out. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.